Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP U.S. History. As today we talk about events leading up to and following a presidential election so great that we still remember its winning slogan today. But first, we need to step back to 1836, when Andrew Jackson, having served 2 terms, was ready to retire. And by this point, he had done many things. He had made the presidency far more powerful than it had ever been before. He had held the Union together in the face of the nullification crisis. But he had also undermined the economy and set the stage for Indian removal. He also appointed, at last, his own Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, having passed away after 35 years on the bench. Roger B. Taney from Maryland became Chief Justice in 1836, having the distinction of being the first Catholic to serve as Chief Justice. And so, with all this behind him and Washington's 2-term tradition in mind, Jackson planned to return to the Hermitage. Now, by 1836, Jackson's enemies had been organized as the Whig Party for 3 years, taking their name from the British political party that had opposed a strong monarchy in Great Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries. And these American Whigs said they would oppose King Andrew and his followers the same way. Although there were many different people who became Whigs, different types of people, with philosophies that did not always mesh together. Now some, like Henry Clay, were Westerners, and others who supported the American system of internal improvements. Others were Northern industrialists and merchants, like those supported by Daniel Webster, who want a protective tariff. Some were Southerners who were still nationalists and wanted a strong central government for the sake of the country, and who trusted the Constitution to protect their ownership of slaves, and so weren't worried about a strong central government, especially one where the power lay in the hands of Congress rather than the president, to protect their interests. Some were evangelical Protestants and reformers, such as the former members of the anti-Masonic Party, who wanted the Whigs to be a party of moral reform. There were even amongst the Whigs who, for the most part, were strong supporters of a strong central government, some Whigs who supported states' rights. So in many ways out of step with the other Whigs, but having joined the party because as supporters of states' rights, they really hated Andrew Jackson for opposing the nullifiers in South Carolina. And so what united all Whigs was a hatred for Andrew Jackson. Just as in all parts of the country, others were bound together by their love of the hero of the common man. In particular, Jackson's party, the Democrats, encompassed farmers and immigrants, and many immigrants feeling more welcomed by the Democratic Party. But people of all classes and all ethnicities, at least various white ethnicities, could be found in both parties in all sections of the country, and as a very important part of this second 2-party system. In many ways, it's defined by whether you liked or hated Andrew Jackson, but also it is defined by 2 parties found across the country. North and South, East and West, there were people who supported each party for a variety of reasons. And both parties tried very hard to maintain themselves as national parties, both fearing what might happen if the country ever divided along sectional lines. Now in 1836, the Democrats and the Whigs held their party conventions to choose their candidates for the presidency. And the Democrats nominated Martin Van Buren, Andrew Jackson's second vice president. Jackson, of course, threw all his support behind Van, the little magician, an old Kinderhook. The Whigs, on the other hand, thought they could do something different in the election of 1836. So at their party convention, to oppose Martin Van Buren, they decided to try to recreate what had happened in 1824, to split the vote among so many candidates that the decision would be forced into the House of Representatives, where the Whigs believed they had the advantage. And so the Whigs ran 4 different regional candidates, again meant to appeal to different parts of the country. One was William Henry Harrison, old Tippecanoe, the great war hero and governor of Ohio, to appeal to Westerners. To appeal to Southerners, they nominated Hugh White, a senator from Tennessee, although also Willie Magnum, a senator from North Carolina, perhaps to unite both Southeast and Southwest. And from Massachusetts, Senator Daniel Webster, to appeal to the Northeast. And the Whigs did split their vote in 1836, but mostly split their own. Did not throw the election to the House of Representatives, rather very clearly gave it to Martin Van Buren, who won with more than twice as many votes as the second-place candidate, William Henry Harrison. And this also gave Van Buren another distinction. And he is the first president of the United States born in the United States. The previous 7 presidents and the president after him had all been born as British subjects. So Jackson retired to the Hermitage, having shaped American politics. In the long run, many of his politics were harmful, but he had a few very important accomplishments too. And he himself had been very popular and retired as a hero in the eyes of the people. Any problems he left behind would end up being Martin Van Buren's problems. And Van Buren would turn out not to handle these very well, which in some ways is strange. He was very intelligent, a brilliant politician, but in some ways brilliant behind the scenes. He had organized a political machine in New York, and indeed a nationwide political machine, to support Andrew Jackson, in many ways creating the Democratic Party. But as a public leader, he was perhaps lacking. Certainly he could not step into Jackson's shoes in terms of personal force or public affection. He was not a war hero. Although he himself was from a pretty humble background, he had not come across as a hero of the common man, and a better backroom politician than a public leader. And he had many problems to face. To the north, there were disputes with Canada. Now, Canada experienced a rebellion in 1837 by French speakers who wanted to protect their culture, and also a rebellion by radical reformers who wanted to limit the power of the colonial government, or perhaps even create a republic in Canada. Neither of these rebellions had any real chance of success, but some Americans hoped otherwise, wanted to help out our neighbors to the north to gain more rights, or maybe just wanted to spite the British. And so some Americans sent military supplies to these Canadian revolutionaries. Some even volunteered to fight on their side. And in 1837, the steamboat Caroline was intercepted by the British carrying supplies across the Niagara River to the Canadian rebels. The British eventually crossed the river into New York and captured the boat at a dock, set the boat on fire, and cast her adrift in the river, where she shortly went over Niagara Falls with one American on board. Clearly a violation of our neutrality, the murder of an American citizen, and this was definitely played up in all the newspapers at the time, who perhaps exaggerated it, but it was unquestionably a real intrusion by the British. Americans were outraged. In response, in 1838, Americans burnt a British ship, Sir Robert Peel, which had docked in an American port. And General Winfield Scott, a general but also at times a skilled diplomat, was sent to Buffalo to make peace and managed to smooth things over. Now, in 1840, a Canadian by the name of McLeod was in a bar in New York and boasted about having taken part in the Caroline raid. He was arrested and charged with murder. The British threatened to go to war if he was not released. And he was released. He also later said he'd been lying, trying to impress people in the tavern while drunk. Now, south of the 49th parallel, clearly within the United States, members of the anti-slavery movement, which though still small was definitely growing, were upset because the United States had recognized the Republic of Texas, a slave-owning country. All they did block Texas actually entering the Union for now. They were unhappy in general, of course, about the treatment of slaves in the South, especially as that was growing harsher following Denmark Vesey's rebellion and Nat Turner's rebellion. They were angry, too, about the possibility of slavery expanding into the West. In Texas, obviously, but perhaps other places, too. Worst of all, Van Buren inherited all the problems caused by the destruction of the Bank of the United States and the loss of much of the government's money in pet banks, and the crash that came in the industry of land speculation following the issue of the Specie Circular, all of which, along with some other things, led to the Panic of 1837. An over-speculation of land, inflation caused by excessive printing of paper money, and a lack of control issued by the pet banks, which themselves were often pretty careless, and Jackson's Specie Circular, and had pushed things over the edge by suddenly halting speculation and inflation, causing many banks to fail. And in a coincidence, or perhaps not a coincidence, because as farms failed, production of grain declined. Grain prices rose. Some people could not afford to buy bread. There were food riots in New York City. On the other hand, cotton prices fell in the South, hurting the South too. So the end of land speculation, the failures of banks hurt the West, rising food prices hurt the North, falling cotton prices hurt the South. And then on top of all this, two prominent British banks failed, in part due to bad loans there made to unwise investors in British railroads. And so British investors who had lent money to American banks and businesses began calling in their loans when times got hard back in Britain. That broke more American banks, bankrupted more businessmen in America. The Whigs called for an expansion of bank credit and for a return of the Bank of the United States or something like it. And they continued to call for subsidies for internal improvements. Building roads and other internal improvements would improve the economy overall in the long run and create jobs building those things in the short run. Van Buren, though, stood by his Jacksonian principles, felt the government should not interfere with the economy. If anything, he felt it was still too involved. It was probably not the solution to our problems, but part of the problem. And so he introduced what was officially called the Independent Treasury Bill, or rather his supporters in Congress introduced it. But it was better known as the Divorce Bill because it was meant to divorce, to fully separate the government's money, and thus the government, from the public banking system, and thus the general economy. The Divorce Bill would have created what they called an independent treasury. This would have taken all government specie out of private banks, pet banks or otherwise, and locked it away in vaults in the U.S. Treasury building and sub-treasury buildings in major cities. It would keep the money safe. It would keep it available to the government, but would keep it from affecting the economy at large. And this was probably more stable and secure than Jackson's system of pet banks, but by keeping the government out of the economy, it would mean the national government could not expand loans or do much to regulate paper money, which it could have done under a well-regulated national bank. Of course, the Bank of the United States had not necessarily been well-regulated. Some of Jackson's criticisms against it had been legitimate, but destroying it and not replacing it was, I think, deeply irresponsible. Now, the Independent Treasury Bill was passed, but was soon repealed, as Martin Van Buren would lose the election of 1840, not to give away the end, But there you go. Because he had been a fairly unsuccessful and unpopular president, but the Democrats nominated him anyway. Again, he was still owed lots of favors and had lots of influence behind the scenes in the party. He was still supported by Andrew Jackson, sending messages from the Hermitage, and it was felt he was still owed something for his years of loyal service. Although some historians have suggested he kind of viewed the presidency itself as his reward, or possibly a semi-retirement. And that's one reason, maybe, he had not put the effort into it he had put into his long political career to that point. The Whigs this time did not try to split the vote. They ran a single candidate, the one who had been the most successful last time, William Henry Harrison, a war hero and former territorial governor, who was seen as being like Jackson, a great Indian fighter, in the days when killing Indians was viewed as a public service rather than approaching genocide. And furthermore, his national political views, if he had any, were not widely known, and so he had not particularly offended anybody. Now, while Harrison had been born on a plantation in Virginia and studied medicine for a time before dropping out of college to join the Army in 1791, and had been governor of the Northwest Territory, the Indiana Territory, eventually Ohio, he was portrayed as a simple man, a poor farmer living in a log cabin and sipping hard cider. Even though, in fact, I'm sure he drank wine and certainly lived in a mansion. But he ran primarily on his war record, recalling his service with Mad Anthony Wayne at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, his victories at Tippecanoe and the Battle of the Thames. He was called Old Tippecanoe or even Old Tip. But in hopes of keeping the party together, in contrast to this Westerner, who did believe, if he believed in anything, in a strong central government, the Whigs chose for his vice president a Southerner and one from the small but still influential states' rights wing of the Whig Party, John Tyler, who had quit the Democrats not because he had really ceased to be a Democrat in his principles, but because he was opposed to Jackson making the government too powerful. So a Westerner and a Southerner, a supporter of a strong central government and a supporter of states' rights. It would seem a good balance. Together they ran as Tippecanoe and Tyler too, while Van Buren was called Martin Van Ruin, for the Panic of 1837 that haunted his entire presidency. And with Harrison taking no real political stands, because that might offend somebody, the entire campaign was run on slogans and electioneering and advertising in log cabins and hard cider, perhaps the first presidential campaign based entirely on style rather than substance. And of course, part of that style was handing out hard cider and whiskey at the polling places on Election Day. Although Tippecanoe and Tyler, too, did not invent that, that had been common to elections for decades, if not centuries. Election Day being a wild party and a major public event in most places, as each party tried to get their supporters drunk, and in public votes where you could see who voted for whom, local politicians or their representatives stood there to shake the hand of the people who voted for them and give dirty looks to those who didn't. And while the popular vote was actually pretty close, separating the two by less than 150,000 votes, about 6% of the total, the electoral vote was very clearly in Harrison's favor, 234 to 60. Andrew Jackson not even carrying his home state of Tennessee, or rather Jackson's chosen successor not winning Tennessee. Tennessee itself often being divided politically. Middle Tennessee supporting their hometown boy, Andrew Jackson, but East Tennessee, which had long viewed Middle Tennessee as a rival, draining power from East Tennessee, tended to oppose Jackson and the Democrats, supporting the Whigs in most cases, and later supporting the Republican Party, one of the few places in the South that would do so. So in Tennessee, perhaps even more than other places, politics would be decided by whether you or your political ancestors loved or hated Andrew Jackson. And it was about love and hatred. Politics had become extremely popular, a significant part of the American culture. The two-party system was cemented as part of our political tradition. This election saw total voter turnout of 78% of registered voters, the highest by far to that point in American history, and one of the highest ever, second highest, I believe. But on March 4th, 1841, William Henry Harrison stood in Washington, D.C. to give his inaugural address. It was, having run as a simple, common man, he wanted to show he was in fact educated. It was a very long speech, full of classical allusions, intricate rhetoric, interminable passages, meant to show he was an educated man, not the rough frontiersman he had campaigned as. Speech lasted 2 hours and 15 minutes after Daniel Webster edited it down for length. And that makes it the longest inaugural address in American history. Besides this, William Henry Harrison was the oldest man elected president to this point, 68 years old, beating out Andrew Jackson, the previous record holder. But to show he was still tough, despite his age, Harrison did not wear an overcoat in the cold March weather. He caught pneumonia and died 30½ days later. Our oldest president to that point, the one with the longest inaugural address ever, but the shortest term and the first to die in office. The Whigs were horrified. Henry Clay, the most influential man in the Senate, Daniel Webster, Secretary of State, had meant to steer the government with Harrison as a figurehead, and so one who would, through their influence, support a strong central government. John Tyler, though, made it clear he was his own man, and his principles were very different from those of Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. And furthermore, Tyler declared not just was he his own man, but he was the president, which today may seem straightforward. The president dies and the vice president becomes president, but it was felt by some, including his own cabinet, that this was not entirely clear. And some said he was just an acting president, whatever that might mean. But Tyler said no, he was the president, thus setting an important precedent that the vice president really became president in his own right, should his president die. This would eventually be codified in the 25th Amendment, but for a long time, like many things related to presidential terms, would remain a matter of tradition rather than law for over a century to come. Furthermore, as I've already mentioned, he was aligned with the states' rights minority faction. The Whig Party was still a Jeffersonian Democrat at heart, just not a Jacksonian Democrat. So Tyler allowed Henry Clay to destroy the independent Treasury. Clay planning, once that was gone, to create a Fiscal Corporation, as he called it, essentially a bank of the United States under another name. But John Tyler vetoed that Fiscal Corporation. Not only did that show he was not going to let Clay boss him around, but also was him standing in line with his Jeffersonian strict construction of the Constitution. So Tyler was hated by many people. He was called His Accidency. He was burned in effigy. There was an attempt to impeach him. There were threats on his life. The Whig Party of Virginia officially expelled him from the party, leaving him a man without a party for almost his entire presidency. And at the direction of Henry Clay, Tyler's entire cabinet resigned, except for Secretary of State Daniel Webster, partly because he was a powerful politician in his own right and didn't want to be seen as Clay's puppet. Also, he was tied up at the moment in some delicate foreign negotiations with Great Britain, which he saw as more important than local partisan politics. Because the United States and Great Britain had remained hostile since the War of 1812, and in some ways were maybe growing more so. The British ridiculed American culture as barbaric, coarse, uncivilized, and unrefined. Among other things, having recently abolished slavery themselves, the British looked down the continuation of that institution in the United States. Another thing, too, was that Americans had a bad habit of not recognizing British copyright. That made Charles Dickens, in particular, hate America. And Americans had a bad habit of not paying back loans made to them by English investors, and of course the occasional habit of trying to invade Canada. Both sides were angry over the Caroline Affair, especially the arrest and then release of McLeod in 1840. And in 1841, Britain annoyed America again in the Creole Affair. The Creole was a ship transporting slaves from Hampton, Virginia to New Orleans for sale. The slaves rebelled aboard the ship, captured the Creole, and sailed to the British colony of the Bahamas, where the British allowed them to stay, which America viewed as a theft of property. But the British did not return them, and 128 American slaves gained their freedom in the Bahamas as a result of the Creole Affair, but many Americans were angry. There was also a long-running border dispute in Maine, or possibly not in Maine. In the Aroostook River Valley, there were about 12,000 square miles of territory claimed both by the British and the United States. And the British wanted to build a road through this area to connect Halifax with Quebec. Lumberjacks from both the U.S. and Canada moved into this area and began fighting in what's known as the Lumberjack War, or the Aroostook War, after the local river, and it looked like this might spread into outright warfare between the U.S. and Britain. The British sent wealthy businessman Lord Ashburton, who was married to an American woman, to negotiate with the U.S. Secretary of State, Daniel Webster. And the Webster-Ashburton Treaty they created in 1842 settled the Maine border, splitting the territory, with the U.S. getting 7,000 square miles and the British 5,000 miles, or square miles, importantly, though, including the planned route for their new road. The treaty also solidified the boundary between Minnesota and Canada. Neither nation was entirely happy, but neither side was unhappy enough to go to war, and the two nations returned to insulting each other with the pen rather than the sword.